Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On May the 30th, 1975, millions, or perhaps even tens of millions of Americans, and millions, probably tens of millions of people elsewhere in the world who were fond of track and field or athletics, as it's called in British English, in general, and of middle and long distance running in particular, woke up to a shocking news item. A talented and very diligently practicing and very courageously running, uh, even front running American runner, 24-year-old Steve Prefontaine, had died in a tragic, apparently single vehicle accident in Eugene, Oregon. Just hours after winning his final race, a 5,000-meter race against a group of athletes, um, only one of whom really gave him a significant challenge, the defending Olympic marathon champion, fellow American Frank Shorter, whom he defeated. Prefontaine's time was 13 minutes 23.8 seconds. I think it was his second or third fastest time at that distance. His record was 13 minutes 21.9 seconds. Although Prefontaine, during his fairly brief career as a world class runner, middle distance and long distance runner, never won even an Olympic medal, nor did he ever set a world record. He still became, in the early mid 1970s, somewhat of an idol. His last name, actually, he was partly of German origin, and indeed, when he started elementary school, he spoke German more fluently than English. So his last name was shortened to Pre. He was not a very tall runner, 5 feet 9 inches, but he compensated for his relatively short stature by hard front running. At the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, West Germany, he took the lead just before 3,400 meters. Until that time, the race had been a pedestrian one. 1,000 meters having been passed in 2 minutes 46.3 seconds, 2,000 meters in 5 minutes 32.6 seconds, and 3,000 meters in 8 minutes 20.2 seconds. So if they had kept going at that pace, the 5,000 meter time would have been outside or slower than 13 minutes 50 seconds. But then Prefontaine really started to push the pace. He accelerated the fourth last lap in 62.5 seconds. The following lap went in 61.2 seconds. However, he was passed before that lap ended by Finland's Lasse Virén, Tunisia's Mohamed Gamoudi, and Belgium's Emil Puttemans. The second last lap went in 60.3 seconds. Prefontaine started a new acceleration at around 4,500 meters. He was able to surprise 3 of the 4 runners who were still with him, all except Virén. Gamoudi was able to catch the leading duo on the second last home straight. However, Ian Stewart of Britain and Emil Puttemans of Belgium started to gradually lose contact with them. Then on the final back straight, Gamoudi first passed Virén. Prefontaine gathered his strength and was able to pass the Finn as well. However, for some strange reason, instead of driving hard all the way to the finish, instead of trying to pass Gamoudi and keep the number 1 spot, keep the lead until the finish line, at the end of the back straight with 200 meters left, he suddenly slowed down. He allowed Virén to pass him on the inside. Then some 40, 50 meters later, he tried to accelerate again in order to pass Virén and then Gamoudi. But Virén started his final kick, which of course meant that he had to move outside Gamoudi, and in order to avoid colliding with the Finn, Prefontaine had to suddenly shorten his stride. Therefore, he lost his rhythm. And although he tried hard, with about 10 meters left, Stewart, who had divided up his energy badly and who indeed ran the last 200 meters faster than anyone else in the field, including Pirén, was able to pass him. On the final steps, Prefontaine desperately tried to lunge, although Stewart was already some or several meters ahead of him. And so he finished fourth, a disappointed fourth. However, he didn't give up. Before his tragic death, he was able to set several American records. For example, at 5,000 meters and 10,000 meters, also at 6 miles. And he was preparing hard for the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal because he wanted to win at least 5,000 meters. And the already epic 5,000 meter final of the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal, with the leading quartet finishing inside 0.8 of a second, would have been probably even much more memorable if Steve Prefontaine had been alive and well and in his top shape. I'm not sure if he would have won. He would at least have come close to a medal, that's for sure. But at least it would have been a much more favorable or a much more memorable race. I'm not sure if he would also have wanted to participate in a boring one with the leading duo, Portugal's Carlos Lopes and Finland's Lasse Viren, breaking away already at 8,000 meters. So here's a closer look at what really happened. This story is based partly on Kenny Moore's book, Best Efforts. I think it was published in 1982, where he introduced the readers to several major, famous long-distance runners from the 1950s to the early 1980s, and added then details of his own, because he too was a long-distance runner and placed fourth at the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich in men's marathon. He also in detail described the so-called Golden Mile race in Oslo, Norway's capital, in Scandinavia, Northern Europe, in August 1979 or July 1979, where Sebastian Coe-Brittain set a new world record. But now back to Steve Prefontaine. He had tried to sleep on the airplane from San Francisco to Eugene, Oregon, squirming in his seat. He had not run as well as he had hoped in the 2 mile, or on the metric scale about 3,219 meter race in Modesto the night before. He had won in 8 minutes 36 seconds, and he was angry at himself for not having run as fast as he could and should have. He had passed the halfway point mile, 1,609 meters, in 4 minutes 13 seconds, and then he felt lethargic, that he just didn't want to run very hard. The American Athletics Union had announced a policy for forcing the best American track and field runners to compete in international competitions against the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, West Germany, and Africa. And those athletes who refused or did not run in the national American Athletics Union competition would be suspended for 1 year if they competed abroad during certain moratorium periods before the American Athletics Union Championships and the international competitions. In July 1975, according to that schedule, there were only about 10 days without the moratorium. So Prefontaine would have had to radically rework his competition schedule for that summer. In his opinion, the American Athletics Union should have allowed the top American middle and long distance runners to compete against the best international runners of those distances. So one 800 meters, 1,500 meters, the mile, 3,000 meters, or even 2,000 meters, 5,000 meters, and 10,000 meters. He listed several names. Finland's Lasse Virén, who, because of his leg injury of the previous spring 1974, which had required a leg surgery in January 1975, and maybe because of some sudden illness, had decided not to participate in the 5,000 meter race, which Prefontaine had won against shorter the other competitors, Belgium's Emil Puttemans, Britain's Brendan Foster, New Zealand's Rodney Dixon, Norway's Knut and Arne Kvalheim, and none of them were in the TV contracts of the American Athletics Union. In his opinion, running against the Czechoslovak and Polish runners was like running against high school boys. Well, in this judgment, he was a bit too cruel, at least. There were some world-class middle and long-distance runners in Czechoslovakia and Poland, even at that time. He was forgetting such runners as Poland's Bronisław Malinowski, although Malinowski had, since 1972, focused on the steeplechase. He had nevertheless placed fourth at the 1974 European Track and Field Championships 10,000 meters before winning the 3,000 meter European title. Then he was also forgetting Czechoslovakia's Josef Janský, who had placed ninth at the 1972 Summer Olympics 10,000 meters. And Czechoslovakia's Stanislav Hoffman, who had placed seventh at the 1974 European Athletics or Track and Field Championships 5,000 meters. Some people, for example, Europeans, would see this as a sign of that American smug insularity. In other words, only selectively being interested in the rest of the world, although there are many Americans who are closely following international events. And then again, you can find those who are only selectively interested in the rest of the world everywhere, including Europe. Well, he wanted to run against the best instead of obeying the American Athletics Union. Prefontaine had organized a month-long visit to northwestern United States by 8 Finnish runners, and then had experienced a series of withdrawals by athletes and promoters. And one of those athletes who had withdrawn was Lasse Virén. Prefontaine admitted that maybe his negative attitude originated from not being able to count on big races where he could have competed against the top international middle and long distance runners. And then I quote from Kenny Moore's book. In the week leading up to the meet last Thursday night in Eugene, where Prefontaine would go against Frank Shorter at 5,000 meters, I, meaning Kenny Moore, happened to talk with several men who knew Prefontaine well, such as John Anderson, who had competed at 1 and had won the 1973 Boston Marathon for men. According to Mr. Anderson, Prefontaine just couldn't relax, and even if he ran 24 kilometers in the forest, he didn't feel satisfied. He was just angry. According to him, Prefontaine always ran hard and strainingly and fiercely. And also then Moore provided some glimpses into Prefontaine's short biography and life, as it turned out tragically. He was a slow learner at school, but he then discovered that he had a talent for running, and that boosted his self-confidence. He set a national high school record, meaning US high school record, of 8 minutes 41.5 seconds for 2 miles, so 3,219 meters, and then ran the mile, or 1,609 meters, in 3 minutes 54.6 seconds. And then he set US records at 2,000 meters, 501.4, 3,000 meters, 742.6, 2 miles, 818.4, 3 miles, 1251.4, 5,000 meters, 1321.9, according to Wikipedia, by the way, 6 miles, 2651.4, and 10,000 meters, 2743.6. Then he mentioned Prefontaine's tragic disappointment at the 1972 Munich Summer Olympics. He ran hard for the last 4 laps, but only finished fourth. Tragic fourth. Just 2 seconds behind the winner, Lasse Viren of Finland, 1 second behind the silver medalist Mohamed Gamoudi of Tunisia, according to the official, and somewhat inaccurate timing because the times were then still rounded off to the nearest 1/5 of the second. In the long distances, it was more like 6/10 of a second behind, or 5/10 of a second behind Ian Stewart of Britain, instead of the official 8/10 of a second. In 1974, he had set 3 American records in Europe. However, he had lost all of those races to Norway's Knut Kvalheim and New Zealand's Rodney Dixon. And Anderson also said that Prefontaine tried too hard to win when he was competing against some fellow runner who was capable of beating him. Earlier in 1975, he had been offered the largest contract in the short history of the professional track circuit, $200,000 at that time, and that was a huge sum of money in 1975. But he refused it because until the Europeans were well and honestly thrashed, he said, "What would I do with all that money?" However, he dreamed of being able to eat outside once in a while, and he liked to be able to drive his sports utility vehicle, MG, which, by the way, had no rooftop, up the Mackenzie River on a weekday afternoon. And he also wanted to pay his bills on time. Two days before his race with Shorter, Prefontaine ran a brief workout under the eye of Oregon track coach Bill Dellinger, who had narrowly finished third at the 1964 Tokyo Summer Olympics 5,000 meters behind Bob Schul of the United States and Harald Norpot of West Germany, and just ahead of France's fading Michel Jazy or Yazi. And when he held a watch during Prefontaine's 330-yard interval runs, Dellinger said that Prefontaine was almost like a movie star in his relationship with the crowd, and he thrived on it. Well, probably Prefontaine, if he was still alive today and competing, would love the fact that people can record, even with their cell phones, amateur movies, let alone with laptops like I'm doing now. Bill Bowerman, Prefontaine's first coach at Oregon State University and later his Olympic coach, said that Prefontaine was too open about his feelings and his ambitions. For example, after Prefontaine ran the U.S. record in 2,000 meters, and then Viren sent him a cable that he was hurt and could not compete against that. He had to be more subtle than he was. That in Bowerman's opinion, Prefontaine spoke his feelings too openly and too often, maybe to earn respect, or maybe he just came across as some young, frustrated runner who was already an adult legally, of course, and had been since 1969, but who was not behaving very, very maturely, and certainly not with kind of professional self-restraint that especially the more seasoned observers of sports in general and middle and long distance running in particular want. On the other hand, someone like Donald Trump would probably have appreciated him, and perhaps did. Donald Trump was alive at that time and surely remembers, or at least should remember, hearing about or reading about Prefontaine, or perhaps even watching a few of these races. There were 8,000 spectators. Before the race, Shorter and Prefontaine lay on the grass of the infield. For the first 3 laps of the 5,000-meter race, Shorter and Prefontaine ran behind Paul Gies, who, by the way, would qualify for the 1976 Montreal Summer Olympics, although he would finish a lackluster 12th at the 5,000-meter final after running reasonably well. I think he was second in his 5,000-meter qualifying heat, while Viren jogged, or well, didn't exactly jog, but only ran as fast as he had to in order to qualify directly in 4th place. At the mile point, 1,609 meters, Shorter led in 4 minutes 17 seconds. At 6 laps, Prefontaine took the lead, and already at that point, Shorter was the only other runner capable of staying with him. At 2 1/4 miles, Prefontaine shot ahead and churned successive laps of 63, 64, and 63 seconds. And on the home straight, he closed his eyes and swung out from the curb slightly. He ran 50 yards or over 45 meters with his eyes shut, and then finished the race in 13 minutes 23.8 seconds. And the crowd, or many members of the crowd, then came to cheer him afterwards. That evening, there was a party at the home of Jeff Hollister, Prefontaine's associate in an athletic shoe company. All the Finnish athletes who had been able to join Prefontaine were present, with many of the families who had housed them or lodged them. They drank beer and ate sandwiches, and there was much talk of going to Helsinki, because at least back then, I think at least until the 1990s, the so-called World Games of track and field were held in Helsinki either in June or July. Yeah, usually in June. And then much discussion of that quarantine rule of the American Athletics Union. John Anderson tried calmly to analyze the difficulty of explaining to the lay people who were not into professional athletics, why athletes had become so enraged at the AAU. Commenting, there is such a gulf or separation distance between us and all those thousands of people who would give their right arms to wear USA on their chest. And then Prefontaine shouted, "Where is the talent that I competed with when I started in 1969, so aged 18? And then he complained that already back then, too many young and talented American runners quit, and this is now an international problem in the Western countries, not just in the United States, but also in Canada, in much of Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. When we look at the top finishers, like, for example, top 5, top 8, top 10 finishers on both the men's, especially on the men's side, but also increasingly on the women's side, in the distances from 1500 meters upwards. So in the major international competitions like the Olympic Games, the World Track and Field Championships, and then the Continental Track and Field Championships, call them the Pan American Games, the European Track and Field Championships, yeah, but I mean mostly the international competitions uh, where athletes from all over the world are welcomed. So not the continental ones. So the um, World Track and Field Championships, and then the track and field uh, finals of the Olympics at 1500 meters, the 3000 meter steeplechase, 5000 meters, 10,000 meters, and the marathon. Many, if not most, of the top finishers come from Africa. And increasingly, those who come from North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand are relegated to the minor places. On the women's side, it's more even, and there is at least one truly world class steeplechaser on the women's side coming from the United States. She's Emma Coburn. Yes. So too many young and talented people quit professional athletics. I mean, because it requires so much discipline, and because they basically have to make a choice. It's very difficult for them to really focus on their studies, to have a decent career after they retire from competitive sports, and to give the best in sports, even though to some extent long distance learning and so-called multi-form learning, attending lectures once in a while and then doing online exercises and assignments can help. But relatively few top athletes can combine wholehearted athletic effort with a wholehearted academic effort. So that's why so many of them quit already in their late teens and early 20s, or then mid or late 20s. Relatively few continue into their 30s and 40s. Unless they want to then build a career out of sports. One way to resolve this dilemma between wanting to have a top international athletics career, for example, in middle and long distance running, and then wanting to get a decent education is to study physical education. Yes, study athletics, study sports sciences. That's of course possible, and no wonder so many of these retired athletes become then coaches and sports organization chiefs or influencers after their athletics career. The shortage is of guys who are out of school and can still figure ways to train and find competition. I'm 24 years old. I'm quoting the late Prefontaine, and Frank, meaning shorter, is 27, and we're veterans. That's the shame. That's what's wrong with the American system, but not only with the American system, with the Western athletic system. And that actually has been one of the reasons why, since the 1990s, I think professional track and field sports has become openly for money, like huge prizes, sports cars, and so forth being given to world track and field champions and so forth. Because still in the 1980s, if you were, or at least in the early 1980s, if you were considered a professional athlete, you were banned from the major international competitions, like Rinaldo Nihimaya, who was a top 110-meter hurdler from the United States. So Moore found himself with Raymond Prefontaine, Steve's father, who seemed daunted by his son's ferocity. And since Kenny Moore and his wife were not good at partying, they left at 11 p.m. Frank Shorter said that Prefontaine would drive him home later, and at about 12:30 a.m. they left the party. So Prefontaine was giving Shorter a ride in his open-top MG on the road above the Moore's house, and confirmed a date for the three of us to run an easy 10 miles or 16 kilometers in the morning. Shorter, who had already qualified as an attorney, a huge achievement because he was also a top level long distance runner internationally, promised to brief Prefontaine on the legal challenges that might be brought against the AAU's restrictions on free international racing. Prefontaine said, "Yeah, well, let's go over that tomorrow when our heads are clear," and he drove off down the hill. And then what happened? The following tragedy, according to Wikipedia. While in the extended right curve near the base um, of the narrow Skyline Boulevard east of the university campus near Hendricks Park, his orange MGB convertible from 1973 crossed the center line, jumped the curb, impacted a rock wall, which is now called Pre's Rock, and flipped, trapping him underneath it while trying to avoid colliding with a car driven by a 20-year-old Swedish-American Karl Bylund. A nearby resident, Bill Alvarado, was first on the scene and reported he found Prefontaine flat on his back, still alive but pinned beneath the wreck. He tried to lift the car to help Prefontaine survive. Unfortunately, he was unable to do that, and he ran off to get help. By the time the medics arrived, Prefontaine's chest had been crushed by his car. Prefontaine had been drinking in the party, and his blood alcohol content was found by the Eugene Police Department to be 0.16. The official cause of death was traumatic asphyxiation. In other words, he had suffocated to death because of the weight of the car, and he had no other injuries that contributed. Comments or tells Kenny Moore. In the morning, the phone rang, waking me, and I learned he was dead. I told Frank. At 8 o'clock, the day was still full of sun and birdsong. From the radio, we learned that the accident had happened only a few hundred yards from our house, and we knew Frank had been the last to see him. A few minutes, we walked down a path through a neighbor's yard to the road below. The ashes of flares were scattered in the road. On one side, beneath an outcropping of black basalt, there was broken glass and twisted metal strewn among the poison oak. There was blood on the street, a street he had run at least 3 times a week for 6 years. And he then commented that Prefontaine was very honest about what he did, including his fondness for alcohol when he was not training. They then ran Frank Shorter and Kenny Moore. According to Moore, it was a sort of observation of ritual, something that had to be done, and that they could not have run a step anywhere where Prefontaine had not run. After they finished a 5-mile or 8-kilometer loop, they kept running, crossing the river over a footbridge where Moore had once seen Prefontaine crouched behind a tripod and movie camera, waving at a tired runner to sprint toward him out of the cottonwoods, yelling, "Do I have to do everything myself?" And this tragic chapter in the book, Best Efforts, ends with the following long sentence. "We avoided the road of the accident coming up," or compound sentence, "coming up the hill to my house another way, a hard climb, feeling the effort, accepting it as the only link left with what Prefontaine had felt and accepted better than any of us." Fortunately, the enthusiasm for middle and long distance running did not end in the United States, although, as I have pointed out, in the major international championships, the World Track and Field Championships and the Summer Olympics, African runners tend to dominate the middle and long distances, especially on the men's side, less so on the women's side, or should I say African-born runners. Of course, there are some North Americans and Europeans who can still compete effectively against them, but but mostly they tend to be the top finishers tend to be either Africans or people of African origin, like the now retired Mohammed or Mo Farah, who used to represent Britain. He's from Somalia originally.